my Father calling, come back to me now. Come back to me now. Come back to me now. Whichever road takes you calling me back. Oh, I feel the wind coming in from east.
That, of course, is the Maccabees with their song "Come Back." Is that amazing that it's all a cappella? I mean, it's some of those guys doing beatboxing. It's amazing. It sounds like instruments. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's a Sunday. We can still say good Vach, Shavua Tov, wish each other a good week. Let's light up the darkness. We have a lot of work to do today. We're doing a double DAF. This is Shekalim, the 5th volume of the Talmud, generally involved with how the temple was run. It's only a 22-page tractate, and today we're going to be covering pages 19 and 20. That leaves just 21 and 22. Today we're going to begin chapter 7, so you would think, since we get to 19 and 20, that we must be in the final chapter of the book. But no, we're doing chapter 7 today. We'll finish chapter 7 tomorrow, and I think we'll probably try to do a double DAF again tomorrow if possible, and that would include a very short chapter 8 here in Tractate Shekalim. So I haven't decided fully yet, but it's quite possible that if we do a double DAF again tomorrow, a double page, then we would be making the siyum, the completion on this tractate. So definitely you want to be tuning in tomorrow at a regular time, 6 p.m., just like today. How's everybody doing? Who's the roll call? Right at the top, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in New York, Renee in Indy, Pauline in Arkansas, Paul in Chicago, Yehuda in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Ann in Merced, Steve, a lovely cool spring evening in Tallahassee, Spencer in Connecticut, Crystal in British Columbia, and saying hello to Yehudis. I love when you guys are talking to each other. That's awesome. James in Indianapolis, John in Sedona, Nancy in North Carolina, Allison in North Carolina, Florence, shalom from Italy. Woke up to catch AT live. Welcome, Florence. Somebody tell me how to say welcome in Italian. Tom, Shavua Tov from Pennsylvania, Crystal loves the Maccabees, Bill from Berkeley, and John from Surfside Beach in South Carolina. And I don't think that's welcome, but that must mean good morning in Italian, right? Buona mattina, that must mean good morning. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia and Lynn in North Texas, excited about the double DAF. All right, there's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Maybe make a little adjustment there. Okay. All right, so here we're at the top of page 19, 19a. We're opening chapter 7. This chapter is about what we do when we find lost articles in and around the temple. Why is this different? There's always a mitzvah to return a lost object, the commandment to return a lost object if possible. The general exception to that is that if it was lost in such a way and in such a place that the owner must have despaired of ever finding it and we're not going to be able to restore it to the owner, then finders keepers. But generally speaking, it's an obligation to return a lost object, even if we have to expend some energy and our own resources in sort of keeping the thing that we find, intact until it can be returned. In other words, if you find a lost animal of your neighbor and you can't return it to him right away, and you know who's going to, who it belongs to, it's going to be able to, it's possible to figure it out over time. You're going to have to feed that animal until you can return it. Here, the special wrinkle is when you're talking about objects that are lost in and around the temple, even around Jerusalem when the temple is standing, the added issue is that these objects, especially if it's money or animals or the meat of animals, it might have been consecrated. It might have been set aside to be offered up in the temple. And now it's a special duty because we want to make sure that we can't keep for ourselves, even if normally we would be allowed to, something that might be consecrated, because that might be misappropriation of consecrated items. In other words, anything that's consecrated technically belongs to the temple. It belongs to God. Somebody set it aside to offer up to God, and so it has to remain in the precincts of the sacred, as it were, and that's something that we're going to have to be careful about. And there's other matters as well. So let's get into the law of lost and found money and other objects around the temple. Here, chapter 7 on page 19 on the A side, the first Mishna. As always, I think without exception, we always cover the entire Mishnah, and then, especially when the pages are long and get a little involved, we will bounce around in the Gemara, in the commentary on the Mishnah. But I always try to read the entire Mishnah. Mishnah 1, here in chapter 7. If money was found on the floor of the temple between one of the collection horns marked shekels and the collection horn marked free will offerings. These collection horns were how they collected money in the temple. Sometimes it was free will donations. Sometimes it was the required half shekel that needed to be donated every year. Hence the name of this tractate, Shekalim, the plural of shekels in Hebrew. But these horns they're called horns because they're narrow at the top and wider at the bottom. They sort of look like a horn, and that's just so you put in the money at the top and somebody might not be nobody would be tempted to reach in and try to steal from the collection horns. Because there are several kinds of them, if money's found on the floor, now we're not sure what that money was intended for, since the horns themselves are labeled for specific purposes in the temple. So money was found between the collections horns marked for shekels, the obligatory shekels, and free will offerings, additional donations that people make. That is to say, as we saw yesterday, there are 13 collection horns. The ones marked for shekels is the first one, presumably the new shekels of this year, as opposed to people who didn't pay last year. There's another collection horn for old shekels. And then the free will offerings are the last 6 or 7, including the last one. So that is to say, between the first and 13th collection horns, as Rav Steinsaltz fills in which funds contributed to the temple were stored. And the following distinctions apply. If the money was found closer to the horn marked shekels, so it is allocated to shekels. If it was found closer to the horn marked free will offerings, the found money is allocated to free will offerings. And if it was equidistant from the two horns, the one marked shekels and the one marked free will offerings, so then we allocate it to free will offerings. That's a little bit surprising, and we'll see why in a moment. If the money was found between the horn marked wood, meaning somebody is donating to fund the wood that is used on the altar, so that the burnt offerings and other offerings that are burned there that's the wood that fires them. And between the horn marked wood and the horn marked frankincense, which accompanies the showbreads, and some other offerings, and that is between the 5th and 6th horns. If it was closer to the horn marked wood, it is allocated to wood. If it was closer to the horn marked frankincense, it is allocated to frankincense. If it was equidistant between the two horns, it is allocated to frankincense. If the money was found between the horn marked pairs of bird offerings and the horn marked doves for burnt offerings, i.e. between the 3rd and 4th horns, so if it is closer to pairs of bird offerings, we allocate to pairs of bird offerings. It was found closer to doves for burnt offerings, it is allocated to doves for burnt offerings. And if it is equidistant from both, it is allocated to doves for burnt offerings. So we've seen 3 examples where, okay, you just put the money, the found money that was found on the floor in the horn that it's closest to. But if it's equally distant from 2 horns, then we make a choice. The Mishnah tells us which one to choose. And what we haven't heard yet is what is the theory, right? What is the principle? We're going to get that momentarily. And similarly, if money was found anywhere else between a container for ordinary, non-sacred money and one containing second tithe money. So that's the money that like a farmer sets aside for himself. The first tithe for the priest, the second tithe for the Levite. The teruma tithe, the teruma gedola, right? The first tithe, that's for the priest. Then what's called the first tithe goes to the Levites, and then what's called the second tithe, the Meiser Sheni, that is something you keep for yourself to fund when you make the pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem for Passover, Shavuos, or Sukkot, so that you have plenty to eat while you're there in Jerusalem. So between so a box that was marked just non-sacred money and a box that was marked for second tithe, this could be in your own house. So if the money was found closer to non-sacred money, you put it there. And if it's found closer to the box for second tithe money, you put it there. And if it's equidistant from both, so you allocate it to the second tithe money. Now, says the Mishnah, this is the principle. In cases of doubt, the ruling follows whichever is closer, even if this involves being lenient. But, if the money was found equidistant from both, the ruling follows whichever allocation involves being stringent, right? In other words, whatever has a little bit of more holiness or has more stringent rules. So when you're not sure, it's equidistant from the two places, you're going to put it in the box that involves greater stringency. Now the Gemara. The Mishnah taught the halacha, the law, governing the case where money was found between the horn-marked shekels and the horn-marked freewill offerings. And the Gemara asks, addressing this case was not necessary, as these horns were not even adjacent to one another. The one marked shekels was the first horn, and the last 6 were marked freewill offerings. Why should it be presumed that the money found in the middle belongs to one or the other, and not to the horns that are in between, right? So if we're talking about something between the first and the last 6, well, there's 5 other offerings between them, or 6 other offerings between the first for the shekels and the 6 marked freewill offerings. Rather, the Mishnah should have addressed the case where money was found between the horn-marked shekels and the horn-marked pairs of bird offerings, because those are adjacent to each other. Rabbi Avon said in the name of Rabbi Pinchas, the contribution horns in the temple were arranged in a circle. So the 1st and 13th were adjacent to each other, and that's why it makes sense to deal with that case. Now we skip down to the end of the Gemara, addressing this first Mishnah. The Mishnah did not consider all the possible places that money could be found between horns. And so the Gemara asks, shouldn't the Mishnah also discuss additional cases, like where the money was found between the 4th and 5th horns, in other words, between the horn marked incense and the horn marked wood, or between the 6th and 7th horns, which is between frankincense and the horn marked for the gold for the ark cover? And the Gemara answers, in fact, this Mishnah does address these cases as well, because it teaches at the end, this is the principle. In cases of doubt, the ruling follows whichever is closer, or if equidistant, whichever allocation involves being more stringent. That is the principle, and that's the takeaway. All right, we move on to the second Mishnah here in chapter 7. This Mishnah considers other situations in which something is found and its source is unknown. Presumably, if you find money near the collection horns, it was intended to be in one of those collection horns, and maybe somebody brought a lot of coins and was kind of pouring them in, and there was people behind, and he felt pressured, and he just dropped one, and so he intended to put it in a horn, and we're just trying to figure out which. That case is pretty clear. Now it could be a little bit more ambiguous. Money found before animal merchants in Jerusalem is always presumed to be second tithe money. Now, obviously, we're talking about in ancient times when the temple was standing and people were coming to Jerusalem in order to bring offerings in the temple, and especially during the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot. So the animal merchants in Jerusalem, why are they selling animals? Because people want to bring offerings to the temple. That's what these animals are for. So therefore, if money is found near these animal merchants, we assume that we follow the majority essentially. What is the most likely case? People were coming up to Jerusalem to spend the festival here. They brought money in their pocket, which was second tithe money, which is, ordained by the Torah to be used for eating during the festivals in Jerusalem. The presumption is based on the fact that in Jerusalem, most of the animals are bought with second tithe money, and they are sacrificed as peace offerings. In a peace offering, a little bit goes up on the altar, and the majority of the offering is eaten by the pilgrim at the feast, right? And we saw that in Tractate Pesachim, that even when you're at Passover, most people are going to be, they're going to be registered in a group to eat the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb. Usually the lamb is too small to feed everybody in the group, so they bring the additional festival peace offerings, and that's what we're talking about here, like the festival peace offerings. And money found on the Temple Mount is presumed to be non-sacred money. Now that is counterintuitive. So if you find money on the Temple Mount itself, meaning within the precinct of the temple, in the courtyard or even in the sanctuary, money that's found there is non-sacred, right? Surprising. You would think that money that you find in the temple, it must have been consecrated by somebody. It must belong to the temple. You found it in the temple. Why would it be presumed to be non-sacred? And the answer is because by the time people enter the temple, they've already bought their offerings, right? Whatever they were going to give to the temple, they already bought it, right? So if they drop money in the temple, that was just their pocket money. They didn't intend to donate that to the temple, and so it is not presumed to be sacred. It's presumed to be non-sacred. And with regard to money found in the rest of Jerusalem, the following distinction applies. If it was found during the rest of the days of the year, meaning not during a festival, it is presumed to be non-sacred money. But if it was found during the time of one of the pilgrim festivals, it is all presumed to be second tithe money, because most of the money found in Jerusalem at the time of a festival is second tithe money. Now, certainly, some of the money that is in Jerusalem, people brought it there, and it wasn't second tithe money. It was just money that they brought to spend in Jerusalem. Or it might have been money that they brought, and they did set it aside to buy offerings with it, even though it wasn't second tithe money. It was consecrated. But what we're doing is following the majority, right? So most people set aside second tithe money, because the number one job in the ancient world, just like it was in America until 150 years ago, was farmer. So most people were farmers who had second tithe money set aside for them to go up, right? It would be the second tithe of their crop, which is like the first 2% for the priest, the next 10% for the Levite, the next 10% for themselves as a second tithe. Now, they could carry the bundles of grain up to Jerusalem and eat it there, but it's so inconvenient, right? But the Torah specifies, it's not even a rabbinic enactment, it's the Torah says that if it's inconvenient to carry the grain up to Jerusalem, you can sell it. You put that money aside as second tithe money, and the Torah says you bundle it up in your hand and carry it up to Jerusalem with you, meaning you keep that money separate. That's your special second tithe money that is going to fund your trip to go to Jerusalem and celebrate the festival there. The Mishnah continues. With regard to meat that was... Oh, no, I wasn't going to do... Well, I'm going to do that. With regard to meat that was found in the temple courtyard. Here it starts to sound a little crazy. I mean, if you found meat on the ground, there's really only one thing that we would do with it in the modern world, and that's throw it away. Right? If you found meat on the ground, you wouldn't think to eat it, you wouldn't think to cook it, you wouldn't think to bring it home. But in ancient times, first of all, there was a lot more scarcity in the world. You wouldn't be so quick to overlook meat that was on the ground. Perhaps it was wrapped anyway, it didn't get dirty. But particularly because there's so much offerings going on in the temple and around the temple in Jerusalem, the issue is this meat could have been consecrated meat set aside. Maybe it was already brought as a peace offering and somebody was walking away from the temple to the place where they were going to have their feast with their family and friends, and they dropped some of this meat. So that's the meat of a peace offering, definitely consecrated, it has to be treated with, kid gloves, as it were, especially. You have to take special care of it. So what are we going to do? With regard to meat that was found in the temple courtyard itself, and it is not known from whence it came. So the law is as follows. If it is whole limbs of the animal in the manner that burnt offerings are brought to the altar, so it is presumed to be burnt offerings. And if it is in small pieces, it is presumed to be sin offerings. And if the meat, because burnt offerings go up entirely, they're burnt entirely on the altar, sin offerings, the meat that is eaten by humans, that goes to the priests. Only the priests eat of the sin offerings. And if the meat in whatever form is found in the city of Jerusalem, as opposed to in the temple courtyard, then it is presumed to be the meat of peace offerings, which the pilgrims themselves can eat. As most of the meat in Jerusalem is the meat of peace offerings. Since it is possible that the time during which it is permitted to eat any of it has already passed, both this and that, whether it is determined to be the meat of burnt offerings or the meat of peace offerings, it can't be eaten. But the question is, how do we handle it? And the way we handle it is its form must be allowed to decay. In other words, it must be left over until it is definitely disqualified. Because what happens is with the meat that can be eaten, the meat of a sin offering or the meat of a peace offering, there's a limited amount of time when it can be eaten. And after that amount of time, it becomes nasar, disqualified because it was left after its time. Just like the Passover lamb, you have to eat it that night. The next morning, it's disqualified. You have to burn what's left. You can't eat it anymore. So with this meat that's found, there's a possibility that it's still in its qualified state. So it has this holiness to it, and you shouldn't burn it yet. So what you're going to do is leave it aside until for sure its time has passed. And the peace offerings, you have the longest amount of time to eat them, which is 2 nights and a day. Or is it 2 days and a night? Now I can't remember. But at any rate, it's like until the 3rd day. And so that you would leave it over until then. It gets a little bit old, and then you burn it. You don't burn it right away. In no case do you eat it because you're not sure. Maybe its time has already passed and it's disqualified for eating. But you're going to wait to burn it until its time has passed for sure. Because it might have been lost right before you found it, or it might have been lost a day or 2 before you found it. And then once its time has definitely passed, it is taken out to the place of burning. With regard to meat, hold on a second. Okay. With regard to meat found in the outlying areas, meaning outside of Jerusalem, if it is in the form of whole limbs, the meat, now if we find meat outside of Jerusalem, so we no longer have any reason to assume that this meat was brought for sacrificial purposes. So the issue when you find meat outside of Jerusalem is not whether it's sacred or not. The issue is it kosher or not? Right? Is it kosher for a Jew to eat it? So if it's found outside of Jerusalem and it is in the form of whole limbs, then the meat presumably comes from the carcasses of animals that were not properly slaughtered. That's a nevela. For meat unfit for eating was generally cut up into full limbs to be sold to be fed to dogs, which is possible for non-kosher meat, or to sell it to non-Jews who will appreciate it and they don't care whether it's kosher or not, because those laws, the obligation to eat meat that's from an animal that was slaughtered in the kosher manner, a particular kind of cut, the blood all drained out, only certain cuts of the cow are kosher to eat. That only applies to Jews. So it's perfectly good meat. It's just, it can't be for Jews. And in the manner of nevelas that were cut up was to leave them as whole limbs back then. So, but if it is in small pieces, it is presumably kosher, and then it is permitted to be eaten as kosher meat was ordinarily cut up into small pieces. Now that there's going to be some limitation on that principle. And if meat is found at the time of a festival, when meat is plentiful, so that it is generally not cut up into small pieces, then even whole limbs are permitted to be eaten. So what we're looking at is what are the logical assumptions that can be made when you find something what time of year is it? What is the mass of people doing? Are the pilgrims flowing up to Jerusalem? Is it likely that it was found on the trail to Jerusalem, or is it just like a regular day in a regular place? And can we assume that it is kosher or not? That's the Mishnah. Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that money found on the Temple Mount is presumed to be non-sacred money. The Gemara asks, shouldn't the Mishnah have said that the money found on the Temple Mount is treated as consecrated money? Most of the money on the Temple Mount is consecrated money. And even if it were not, one ought to be stringent and regard any money found in the temple courtyard as possibly consecrated. So why can we assume that it is non-sacred? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Ba said that Rabbi Chiya said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, there is a presumption that the priest who is in charge does not remove money from the chamber until he deconsecrates it by transferring its consecrated status onto the animals that he purchases for offerings. Therefore, any money that is found on the Temple Mount is presumably non-sacred. So this is another explanation why we assume that money found in the temple courtyard is non-sacred rather than sacred. The first explanation was because people have spent their money for offerings before they enter the temple, so any money found there must have been their pocket money. Here's the alternative explanation, is that the priests are very meticulous with the money that belongs to the temple. The only time that money comes out of the treasury is when it's used to purchase offerings and other matters that are necessary for the temple. When the temple treasurer expends funds for something that the temple needs, then the thing that is bought becomes consecrated and the money used to purchase it is deconsecrated. That's very important so that the vendors who provide animals and other objects to the temple can get paid, right? For them to get paid and be able to use the money that they receive, the status of that money, when it belonged to the temple, it was consecrated. When they purchased something from the vendor, it became deconsecrated. We skip down a little bit. It was further taught in a baraisa with regard to the meat of an unknown source. So here's another example that has nothing to do with the temple. If one bought meat in a town that has 10 stores, 9 stores selling the non-kosher meat of a carcass, meaning it wasn't slaughtered in a kosher manner, and 1 store selling the meat of a properly slaughtered animal, and the person was confused about them. He can't remember which store he made his purchase. So there's 10 butchers in town. 1 is a kosher butcher. The other 9 are selling non-kosher meat. He knows he went into one of the butcher shops in town, but he's not sure which one it was. He's not sure if he bought meat from the kosher butcher or not. 9 are not kosher. 1 is kosher. What do we do in that situation? He's confused about them, so he must be concerned that perhaps he bought non-kosher meat. However, the meat is forbidden only because of an uncertainty. And if he ate it, he is not liable to receive lashes, right? So the penalty for eating non-kosher meat on purpose, and of course, if you were warned, that's non-kosher meat. If you eat it, you will be liable to receive lashes. And that you receive that warning in the presence of 2 witnesses, and then immediately after you receive the warning and in the presence of 2 witnesses, you ate the meat anyway, then you would be liable to receive lashes. However, in this situation, even if you were warned and even if the witnesses were there, you would still not be liable to receive lashes because you might have eaten unkosher meat and you might not. Even though you likely ate unkosher meat because 9 out of the 10 shops are not kosher, it's still a case of doubt, and in a case of doubt, we don't administer corporal punishment. And if a piece of meat was found in the marketplace and it is not known from which store the meat came, so now it's a different situation, not whether you bought it and you can't remember where you bought it, but rather you just find a piece of meat in the marketplace. 9 stores sell non-kosher meat, 1 store sells kosher meat. You find a piece of meat in the marketplace, you do assume that it is not kosher. You follow the majority. And for the reverse case, if 9 stores were selling the meat of a properly slaughtered kosher animal, and one store was selling the non-kosher meat of a carcass, and one bought meat in one of the stores, but he was confused about them. He can't remember which store he made the purchase, so he must be concerned that perhaps he bought non-kosher meat. So he should be concerned, but again, of course, you wouldn't administer lashes if he ate it, and if he was warned and ate it anyway. And if a piece of meat was found in the marketplace and it is not known from which store the meat came, one follows the majority, and we presume that the meat is kosher. Now, let's follow up on that. What is the law, the halacha? Where did the halacha on this debate come out? If meat was found lying in the marketplace, its status is determined in accordance with the majority, as per the principle that anything separated out is presumed to be from the majority. Therefore, if the majority of the meat sellers in that town are non-Jews, the meat is prohibited. If the majority are Jews, it is permitted. And the same law applies to meat that is found in the possession of a non-Jew, and it is not known from whom it was purchased. If the majority of the meat sellers in that town are Jews, so by Torah law, the meat is permitted to be eaten. However, right, this has all been very permissive in these cases of doubt where it's probably kosher. So by Torah law, the meat is assumed to be kosher. But we know how stringent the certifying authorities are, like the Orthodox Union and Circle K and Star K. They're very stringent. In cases of doubt, they don't just say, oh, well, just go after the majority. It's likely okay. Why are they so stringent? So the law continues. The sages, however, rendered prohibited any meat that was found at all, whether in the marketplace or in the hand of a Gentile, even if all the slaughterers and all the meat sellers in town are Jews. Even if all the meat sellers are Jews, meat that is found, we don't eat it because we can't be sure that it's kosher. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi based on the Gemara in Tractate Chulin. So, we have this principle recorded and memorialized here in the Talmud that we go after the majority, even in the case of the meat found in the marketplace where the majority of the meat sellers sell kosher meat. But in terms of are we permitted to eat something that is doubtful whether it's kosher or not, the rabbis drew that fence around the Torah and said, no, you can't eat that. And that is not surprising. A certain man in Tzipori, so Tzipori in the north of Israel, near the Sea of Galilee, was walking, and he wanted to buy a piece of meat from the butcher. But the butcher did not give him the meat, as they were enemies. This man and the butcher didn't like each other. They had a falling out, and the butcher didn't want to sell him meat. But he's got a problem. He wants to buy meat. The butcher won't sell him meat. So what's he going to do? The man asked a certain Roman. So now we get, right, this is Tzipori in northern Israel during the time of the Roman occupation. So the man asked a certain Roman, meaning a non-Jew, to buy the meat on his behalf. And the Roman bought the meat. The man later said to the butcher, did I not in the end take the meat from you against your will? The butcher said to him, well, did I not give him the non-kosher meat of a carcass? And so the meat that you received from him was not kosher. Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, an incident like this came before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who said about this, it is not within his power, meaning his own power, to prohibit all the butcher shops of Tzipori on that day, since the majority of meat shops in that city belong to Jews. The butcher's claim that he gave the Roman non-kosher meat is not to be believed. So in other words, if that was true, that this kosher butcher sold non-kosher meat even to a non-Jew, they actually would have to issue a public announcement and say all the meat is prohibited in this town in certain situations, but not in this situation because the majority of the butchers remain kosher butchers. And likely, really what happened here is this butcher, wanted to make his enemy feel insecure about his little device that he used to purchase meat from the butcher that didn't want to sell it to him. It is related that Rav went down there to Babylonia, meaning he went from Israel to Babylonia. It's always called going down to Babylonia or going east to Babylonia. So Rav went down to Babylonia, and he saw that they were lenient about meat of unknown origin. So he was stringent with them. They were too lenient, so he came as a rabbinic authority and said, no, you need to be more stringent. And he issued decrees of greater stringency. And the Gemara now reports what it is that Rav saw. A certain man went and he wanted to rinse his hat in the river. While doing so, the piece of kosher meat that he was carrying fell, and that man went on his way. Later, he returned to that very place and he found a piece of meat identical to the one that he dropped, and he wanted to take it. But I guess he had a question whether it was okay for him to eat it, because the question came before Rav. Rav said to him, "This meat is forbidden to you. As I can say, it is possible that the river swept away that piece of meat and brought in its place a different piece of non-kosher meat that had fallen into the water somewhere else." And so now we see how that kosher implies very high levels of stringency. It's very unlikely that this guy who went to wash his hat by the river, he happened to drop his meat. He went on his way. He said, "Oh my gosh, I dropped my meat." He went back to the place where he washed his hat. He recognized the place. And right where he washed his hat, there's a piece of meat identical to the one that he lost when he was washing his hat. Obviously, it's his piece of meat. But because it wasn't under his control for a certain amount of time, Rav said to him, "You can't be sure. Maybe your piece of meat was swept away. Somebody else dropped a piece of meat in the same place. Could happen. Unlikely, but it could happen. And based on that remote possibility, we're stringent, and you can't eat that meat anymore. Now you can feed it to the dog or sell it to somebody who's not obligated in the laws of koshers." Now, who is Rav? It's worth taking a moment here to do a little background on Rav. We mention his name all the time. So here's a beautiful, succinct sort of bio of Rav. His full name was Rabbi Abba Bar Ivu. And he was the first and perhaps the greatest of the Babylonian Amoraim. The Amoraim, and Amora is a rabbi of the Gemara, meaning a rabbi of the Talmud, as opposed to a rabbi of the Mishna. The earlier sages of the Mishna, a single one is called a Tana, and plural Tanaim. These later rabbis of the Gemara, normally the Talmud is the Gemara and the Mishnah together, but when we just say a rabbi of the Talmud, we mean of the Gemara, who's doing commentary on the Mishnah. And so those are called, that's an Amora. And then later rabbis are Geonim and Rishonim and Acharonim. That goes all the way up to our period. Okay, but Rav is the first of the Amoraim, meaning he overlapped with the Tanaim. He knew the rabbis of the Mishnah. He was taught by them, but he educated, his students were the Amoraim, and he sort of straddles those two. He is known as Abba Aricha because of his great height. Rav established the academy in Surah that lasted for over 800 years. 800 years! He founded a school, a yeshiva, that lasted for 800 years. America's like 250 years old. Rav's yeshiva was active for 800 years. Amazing. And through the period of the Geonim, right? So the Geonim are the next sages after the Talmud is closed, right? So the Talmud is composed with the Mishnah and the Gemara. There's gonna be commentary in every generation since, but after the Talmud is published or redacted, let's say, by Ravina and Ravasi, then I always get that confused, Ravasi or Ravashi. I have to look at that quick. But after that, they're no longer called Amoraim, they're called Geonim. Okay. Let's keep going. Aside from the visiting students who attended the academy only during the months of Adar and Elul, the Gemara reports that 1,200 full-time students learned in the academy throughout the year. In his youth, Rav traveled to Eretz Yisrael with his uncle, Rabbi Chia, where he studied under Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the sage who redacted the Mishnah. He traveled back and forth between Israel and Babylonia until he settled in Babylonia in the year 219 of the Common Era. Rav's greatness is apparent not only from the large number of Amoraim who were his students and who quote him throughout the Gemara, but also by the fact that he is recognized as the last of the Tanaim and is permitted to disagree with Tanaitic rulings, right? The later rabbis can't dispute the earlier rabbis. They can dispute the interpretation. They can say, well, there's a dispute between Tanaim, and so I favor this one over that one. But if there's a solid ruling by the Tanaim, the Amorim can't come later and reverse it, except in very, very extenuating circumstances. Rav's teachings are found throughout both the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. Among his many rulings are several that deal with issues of marriage, such as his ruling that man cannot marry a woman without first meeting her, and the requirement that underage girls cannot be married until they're old enough to state whom they want to marry. His rulings in the area of ritual law were invariably accepted, although the rulings of his colleague and adversary, or let's say, disputing partner, Shmuel, were accepted in criminal and financial matters. Rav's son, Rabbi Chia, followed his father's footsteps and became a great scholar. His other son, Ivu, was a merchant. So that's Rav, who we mention so often. Now we have a little bit of background on him. The Gemara relates another incident where Rav was stringent about meat of doubtful provenance. A certain man was walking in the market, and he was carrying a piece of kosher meat. A kite came. A kite is a type of hawk. So a kite hawk came and snatched it from him, and later cast it away elsewhere. The man returned and wanted to take the piece of meat from the place where he saw the bird drop it. He saw the bird drop his piece of meat. Rav, however, said to him, "This meat is forbidden for you to eat. As I can say, it is possible that the kite hawk was carrying non-kosher meat, and that is what it cast away in this place. It then took away the other piece of meat that it snatched from you." Right? So since you can't be sure, meat only remains kosher if the whole supply chain can be guaranteed. It is further related that the Ginei River once swept away wineskins belonging to Jews, and the wineskins were later found along the riverbank. The incident came before Rabbi Yitzhak, the son of Rabbi Elazar, who said, "Let the Jewish wine dealers come and examine the knots on the wineskins. If they recognize the knots as theirs, the wineskins are presumably theirs, and the wine in the wineskins is permitted." Right? So we don't go so crazy that as soon as something is lost, it's sort of outside the chain of transmission of ensuring its kashrus, and therefore it can never be recovered. Meat, one piece of meat, even though it looks similar, it could be the same as another. But if you really have identifying marks on the container of the kosher food, then even though it was dropped or swept away in the river and then it was recovered, if you can say, "No, that's definitely my container, I recognize it," okay, then it will remain permitted. It is further related that a roasted goat was once found in the street in the town of Gufta, and the rabbis permitted it to be eaten based on two considerations. First, because of found property. That is to say, they allowed the finder to keep it. And secondly, because of the majority of traffic. In other words, the majority of people passing through that street were Jews. And the Gemara explains, because of found property, as it was taught in a Baraisa, one who rescues an article from a lion, from an enemy army, from rocks in the sea, or from rocks in the river, or from a large public street, or from a large public square. In all these cases, these articles belong to him, even if they have an identifying mark on them, because the owners have given up hope. The owners have despaired of ever recovering the lost object. And for this reason, the rabbis ruled that the goat belonged to its founder as it was found in the street. in such a public place that the owner must have despaired of recovering it. The rabbis also permitted the goat because of the majority of traffic. Since most of the people who passed through that street were Jews, it stands to reason that a Jew had lost the roast goat, and the rabbis were not concerned that it was the product of a non-Jew slaughter, a non-Jew's slaughter, meaning that it was not slaughtered in a kosher manner and therefore not kosher. The Gemara adds that in the end, the goat was indeed found to be from the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and therefore it was certainly kosher. Now, a little note on this thing about finders keepers and one who rescues an article from a lion. An article that was lost under circumstances where it was irretrievable by anyone. For example, it was swept away by the sea or a river, or it was about to be burned in a fire or eaten by a beast. It belongs to the finder, even if it has an identifying sign. Now, this is the case even if the original owner has not yet despaired of finding it. He hasn't actually despaired of finding it. And even if he is standing there shouting that it is his. Now, the Rima writes that in any event, it may not be the finder in a situation where the owner must have despaired or would eventually despair because it was lost in a place where nobody would ever expect to recover it. Maybe he hasn't despaired yet. Maybe he's even shouting, sort of like in a final, last ditch hope that maybe somebody will find it and walk by and saying, I lost this thing. So because it was in circumstances where it's certainly lost, the finder is permitted to keep it. But the Rima, great commentator, the Rima, writes that in any event, it is good and proper to return the article to its original owner. If, however, the lost article was not irretrievable and it was possible to save it in some manner, it does not belong to the finder if it has an identifying sign. So don't be too quick to assume that it was irretrievable, right? Like it's something you might say, well, the example said if it was, lost in a lion's cage or in front of a beast or on a big city street or in a big city square, then that means it's not findable. Maybe, but if it's very identifiable, or it's a type of place where people tend to be ethical people that try to return lost objects, so then you can't assume it's irretrievable. And the right thing to do, and even the obligatory thing to do, is to find a way, if at all possible, to return the lost item to its owner. I already did that. Okay. Rabbi Mana said in the presence of Rabbi Yosef, but I saw the rabbis announcing that they had found lost property even when the item was found in a public area. And Rabbi Yosef said to him, if you were to find an article in a public area, you would not take it either. Rabbi Yonah, your father, did not say this, but said, if only that when we find some item, we should find it in a place that will not require us to announce its discovery, for example, from the gate outward to a public area. And the Gemara notes that even so, when Rabbi Yonah found a lost article in a crowded place, he did not take it for himself, but rather announced that he had found it so that he could locate its original owner. And so what we see here is that, if somebody found something in this kind of public area, and it's pretty certain that the owner, the one who lost it, would have despaired of ever finding it again, we're not going to blame the one who found it and kept it. We're not going to ascribe liability to him for a transgression because it was pretty much common sense to assume that the owner must have despaired and that it just wasn't going to be able to return it to its owner. However, one who is pious, one who tries to go above and beyond the law and to be there for his fellow man and his fellow woman, that person, even though he could keep it, will make every effort to return it to its owner, including announcing that the lost object was found. Right? Now, you don't want to announce that something lost has been found in a way that, opportunists will come and say, oh yeah, I lost it, even though they didn't lose it. You want people who come forward to have, that's why it's so important that it has some kind of identifying mark. It's not just a coin that was dropped, but it's in a sack, or it was a certain amount of money bound together, it was meat bound with a string, some kind of identifying mark so that the one who comes forward and says he lost it can make a legitimate claim. That finishes the commentary on the second Mishnah. We're almost done, so if you have questions and comments, get them in here. Here's the third Mishnah in chapter 7. If an animal that is fit for the altar was found straying from Jerusalem as far as Migdal Eder, and similarly if it was found within that distance from Jerusalem in any other direction, it is presumed that the animal came from Jerusalem. Most of the animals in Jerusalem were designated for offerings, and presumably this one was as well. Males are presumed to be burnt offerings, as only males are brought as burnt offerings. Females are presumed to be peace offerings, as it is permitted to bring a female peace offering. Rabbi Yehuda says an animal that is fit for the paschal offering, the Korban Pesach, for Passover, i.e. a 1-year-old male lamb or kid, is presumed to be a paschal offering, provided that it was found within 30 days before the festival of Passover. Originally, the court would seize collateral from one who found such an animal as security until he would bring with it the libations associated with this offering, as if the found animal were his own and he had committed himself to bring the libations. This brought about a situation in which those who found the animals began leaving them where they found them and absconding so as not to become liable for the libations, right? The oil and the wine, the frankincense, the meal offerings, the loaves of bread, that whatever for a particular offering is necessary to accompany that offering, this person who found an animal and took care of it, you know, we're not going to be able to return it to its owner, but it's assumed to be a consecrated animal, so it needs to be brought to the temple and offered up. And now, and originally, the one who found it then became liable to pay for the libations that were going to accompany the offering. But because people then didn't want to undertake that cost, they started saying, well, I didn't see anything. Not my animal. Sorry, didn't see it. Not my problem. The court therefore instituted that the libations accompanying these found offerings would come from public funds, that is, from the temple treasury. Rabbi Shimon said the court instituted 7 ordinances with regard to the financial aspects of offerings and consecrations. And this ordinance, namely that the cost of the libations accompanying the sacrifice of a found animal is borne by the public, is one of those 7 ordinances. These are the other ordinances. If a Gentile sent his burnt offering from abroad, from outside the land of Israel, right? Because Gentiles can bring offerings when the temple is standing. They can't bring sin offerings, for example, because a sin offering is an obligatory offering of a Jew who transgressed. But a Gentile, or like any person, can bring a voluntary free will offering like a peace offering or a burnt offering. So if a Gentile, I don't know about a peace offering, but definitely a burnt offering, as we see here. If a Gentile sent his burnt offering from abroad, outside the land of Israel, and he sent with it the money for the purchase of the libations that must accompany it, so then the libations are offered at his expense. But if the Gentile did not cover the costs of the libations, it is a condition of the court that the libations are sacrificed at the public's expense with funds taken from the temple treasury. And likewise, in the case of a convert who died and had no heirs and left animals that he had designated as offerings, if he has the libations, in other words, if he also set aside money or the libations themselves or money to buy the libations, well, then the libations are sacrificed from his estate. And if he did not do so, then the libations are paid for with the public funds. And another ordinance, it is a condition of the court with regard to a high priest who died, and the new high priest had not yet been appointed to his place, that his meal offering, i.e. the griddle cake offering that the high priest would bring each day from 1/10 of an ephah of flour, would be sacrificed from public funds. Rabbi Yehuda says it was brought from the property of the high priest's heirs, in other words, his estate, and not from public funds. In any event, the offering was not brought, as it would have been brought by the high priest himself were he still alive, half in the morning and half in the evening, but rather it was sacrificed all at once from a whole 1/10 of an ephah. The fourth ordinance was about the salt in the temple that was designated for salting the offerings, and the fifth was about the wood that was used for the burning of the offerings, These ordinances decreed that the priests may use them also to prepare the meat of the offerings that they eat, right? Remember that for sin offerings, for example, some of the meat doesn't go up on the altar but is eaten by the priests, and the court decreed that the priests can use the wood that belongs to the temple and the salt that belongs to the temple to prepare this food that they eat for themselves from the sin offerings. And the sixth ordinance concerned the red heifer, that deriving benefit from its ashes is not considered misusing consecrated property. And the seventh ordinance was about disqualified pairs of bird offerings. It ruled that their replacements should come from the public funds. Rabbi Yosei disagreed and says the expense does not fall upon the public, but rather upon whoever supplies all the pairs of bird offerings to the temple. He must also supply at no additional charge the replacements for the disqualified birds. And the halacha follows Rabbi Yosei. I just have one very quick thing to add from the Gemara, and then that's all we're going to cover today. Since the Mishna mentioned the griddle cake offering of a high priest who had died, the Gemara records what Rabbi Yessa said about similar matters. While I was there in Babylonia, I heard the voice of Rav Yehuda asking Shmuel, if one set aside his shekel and then died before handing it over to the treasurer, what is to be done with the shekel? And Shmuel said to him, it is allocated to free will offerings and it is used for the purchase of free will burnt offerings. It was further asked, what is to be done with leftover money that a high priest set aside for the purchase of his griddle cake offering made from 1/10 of an ephah of flour? If a high priest designated money for the purchase of flour for his meal offering, and it turns out that he set aside too much money, what is to be done with the extra money? Rabbi Yochanan said, the money goes to the Dead Sea, meaning it is destroyed. And Rabbi Elazar disagreed and said the money is allocated to free will offerings. And the law on that, leftover money from the 1/10 of an ephah, the leftovers from the high priest's griddle cake offering are destroyed in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. We saw that before because the high priest is obligated to bring that offering every day, a specific offering each day. Leftover money can't be used for tomorrow's offering because there's special money already essentially set aside for that offering of tomorrow. Only the high priest can make this offering, so there's no other use, there's no other permitted use of that money. It's the sanctities of the highest order, and so it has to be destroyed, and that little bit of money is thrown in the Dead Sea. In other words, that money has to be lost in such a way that it can never be used for any other purpose because its consecration is of the highest order. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me check comments and questions here on our double DAF, pages 19 and 20. Thank you. I asked earlier how we say welcome in Italian. Benvenuto. So benvenuto to Florence Martino and all our friends tuning in from Italy. Tom, when we behave with scrupulous honesty, do we get a reward from God or merely God's satisfaction that we are behaving with proper honor? It seems to me that too many people take pride in being moral and ethical and decent, whereas shouldn't that be the most basic norm? Tom, that's a beautiful, beautiful insight, and you're absolutely right? So the Talmud tells us elsewhere, when we die and our soul leaves this world and we go to heaven, the first question will be asked is, were you honest in your business affairs? Meaning, were you honest when no one else was looking? When you could easily get away with it, were you honest? On the golf course, when no one was looking, and you took a swing, a real hard swing, and you didn't even touch the ball. It was such a bad swing. And you think, oh God, that can't count. But it does count. Whenever you swing with intent to hit, it's a stroke. No one saw it, but you gotta count that stroke, even though it might ruin your good score that you were working on. Those kind of things, you're absolutely right. We shouldn't be proud of ourselves that we were honest when no one was looking. That is the default level honesty that we're supposed to live at. Now, not everybody does, I'm sure all of us can look back at some point in our lives where we did something like, when we look back, it was a little bit of a sketchy decision. I should have done better. I promise to do better, and eventually we elevate ourselves, so maybe we live in such a way that we would never do that kind of thing again. And so we've made it to Shuvah. We've made an atonement. We have changed, and we've become more rigorously honest than we were. So that is something to be proud of, because we've made a change and elevated, but it's not something that, we should brag about. You're absolutely right, Tom, because we should have been that honest in the first place. Yosef, been meaning to ask. You mentioned some rabbis whose description of the temple go back to when it was standing. Is there a resource or list I can look at showing those names who are talked about in the Mishna? In terms of the chronology of Chazal, right? The Chachamim, the sage, a sage is a Chacham, and the acronym is Chazal, right? The Chachamim, the sages of blessed memory, Zichrono Livraha. So when we say Chazal, we're talking, it's actually a plural word, and we're talking about the sages of blessed memory. So a chronology of Chazal, where it shows which which decades they lived in. I'm not sure it's listed that way. Maybe you could find that. But I definitely recommend this resource, the Art Scroll Introduction to the Talmud. It's great. It has beautiful, beautiful biographies of all the sages, or at least all the major sages, hundreds of them, that we cite their rulings in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. So this is a really good resource. And so, first just go to the Tanaim, because there were no Amoraim alive when the temple was standing. The Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi redacted in about the year 200. The temple was destroyed in about the year 70. So there was 130 years after the temple had been destroyed, when there were definitely Tanaim making rulings. And so in terms of which of those sages were early enough that they themselves saw and experienced what was going on in the temple when it was standing, people like Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, etc. I'm sure you can find a chronology. I can't think of one offhand, but this covers their stories. And even if they're not listed chronologically, any one that you're curious about, you'll find in here. And there are other nice books also. This is Alfred Kolach's Masters of the Talmud, Their Lives and Views. And then there's a series, I have it over there, by a Rabbi Lau, not Benjamin Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel, but I think it might be his son. But there's another Rabbi Lau who did, I think 2 or 3, or maybe 4, at least 3 volumes of the lives and rulings of the sages. So there's resources like that can be very useful. Tom, when the Mishnah you read... when the Mishnah you read and its teachings you plead, that's Amora. That's funny, Tom. That's Amora. Good. Steve Rivich, I'm not sure we have time to discuss the difference between an offering and a sacrifice. There's not really much of a difference. These English translations are a little bit loose, but generally speaking, we mean the same thing. We mean the same thing. In other words, an animal that is consecrated to be brought up on the altar, that's a sacrifice. It's a korban. There are some other words, and maybe sometimes they distinguish offering versus sacrifice. One translation, meaning one term or the other. But at least for me, I'm using those terms interchangeably. So I'm not distinguishing between offerings and sacrifices. There is, Kodesh Kodashim, like offerings of the highest sanctity and offerings of lower sanctity. So the Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, is actually lower sanctity than a burnt offering, an olah, meaning an elevation offering, because it all goes up in smoke. And so there are greater stringencies associated with the offerings of the highest sanctity. But in terms of offering versus sacrifice, I'm using those terms interchangeably, at least until I have a reason not to. Okay, that's what I've got for us today, my holy sisters and brothers. Probably another double daf tomorrow, and therefore a siyum on tractate Shekalim. Looking forward to that. Have a great night. All the best.